So normally on this channel, I talk about movies. You guys know that's my primary focus here, but I also really love video games, and I have for some time now. And in the past, I have covered video games a little bit, but it's usually just been news-related things, like that video I did on the Nintendo Switch when we got info about it leading up to its release. Or when E3 was happening, sometimes I would break down some trailers that we saw. But I've never actually done a video game review on this channel, and it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. And since next week we have the release of The Last of Us Part 2 on PS4, I thought what better thing to do a video on today than one of my favorite games of all time, The Last of Us. And just so you know ahead of time, we are going to be talking in major spoiler detail for The Last of Us, so if you have not played the game, I highly recommend that you do. It's one of the best games I've ever played, because we are going to be getting into major details in terms of character moments and storylines that I really like in the game, so go out and play it, then come back and watch this video. Let's get into it. But first, before we talk about The Last of Us, I do want to give you guys somewhat of a background as to my history with video games, because I haven't been playing them for a particularly long time. When I was a kid, like most people, I had a Nintendo Wii, and that was my first real introduction to gaming. That was the first console that I owned. And I played a lot of Lego games and Mario games and stuff like that. But I was never really a gamer back then, and once people kind of started phasing out of the Wii and people stopped playing it, I kind of stopped playing video games. And then a little while after, I started getting back into them. Towards the end of my middle school years, my parents got me a Wii U for Christmas. And we all know that wasn't really the best console, but that's kind of how I got back into video games. But even then, I was still playing like Mario and the usual Nintendo stuff. And it wasn't until a little while after that I realized that video games could be something more, that they could be more than just jumping on turtles and hitting question mark boxes for coins and stuff. And while all that stuff is great, I finally realized that video games could be just as artful and as moving and as deep as movies are. Then I bought a PS4 because I wanted to play some stuff that was a little bit deeper than your average video game. And I did. I played stuff like Uncharted and the Batman Arkham games, but there was this one game that I always heard about called The Last of Us. I didn't play it when it came out on PS3 because I never had one, but I'd always heard of its reputation as this generation-defining game with this incredible story and great characters. And that's something I had always wanted to play. So once I got a little bit older, I finally played it on the PS4 with the remastered version that they made. So in the very first scene, we're introduced to the character of Joel and his daughter Sarah. We see how they live a very normal life. They just watch TV and talk together in this little moment. And then you get to play as Joel's daughter as she walks around and realizes that something isn't right. Joel comes smashing through this glass window and shoots their neighbor right in front of Sarah because they're clearly zombies at this point. And then Joel and Sarah escape with Tommy. What I've always loved about this opening is how it perfectly sets up the world that the game takes place in. With most zombie entertainment, like movies or TV or even video games, you're just kind of thrown into the world after the outbreak happens, and you don't really get to see it happen. But in this opening mission, you get to see the pandemic happen through the eyes of a young girl, and it's terrifying. You literally watch society crumble in like the very beginning of this game, and there's zombies running everywhere, and people are just frantic and scared, and it all feels so real. And then we have the death of Joel's daughter, which is extremely sad, the way she dies in his arms. When I played this for the first time, I almost cried, and at this point we're only 15 minutes into the game. So we've only spent 15 minutes with these characters, but I cared about them that much that it elicited that emotional of a reaction in me. I just think that's remarkable. And then we have the opening credits where the theme song plays. Also, this is one of my favorite theme songs in a video game ever. Gustavo Santoya, which I think is how you pronounce his name, his score for this game is unbelievable. The theme is really great, but the music in the rest of the game is amazing. It's very minimalist, and it's not very loud or anything. It's just kind of subtle and quiet. It's the way that it's able to capture the mood and the atmosphere of this broken world that I think is just really special. And then the game cuts to 20 years later. We see how Joel is dealing with his post-apocalyptic life. He's kind of settled down with this group of survivors, and they scavenge for weapons and materials and stuff like that. And then we get introduced to the character of Ellie, who I have to say is one of my favorite characters in video games. She is amazing. One of the reasons that I love her is this, and this kind of goes for a lot of media, but especially in video games. Usually when we have female characters, they're often over-sexualized, or they're just secondary to a male character, or they just don't really serve a purpose in the game and they're just kind of insignificant. Ellie is the exact opposite of that. She is such a little badass, and you see that from the very first moment that she's in the game. She's also really funny. The game does a really good job of fleshing her out, and she actually feels like a real person. And I'll get more into that aspect with some of the later points in the game. But from here, Joel and this other character named Tess are tasked with escorting Ellie to this group called the Fireflies. We later find out that Ellie's been infected for 3 weeks, and whatever happened to her is the key to finding the cure for the virus that caused this pandemic in the first place. You get that great scene with Tess where you find out that she's been infected, and she kind of just pleads with Joel for him to take Ellie over to the Fireflies to hopefully end this horrible reality that they live in. And this really sets the story of the game in motion, where you go on this adventure across this post-apocalyptic America with Joel and Ellie. And on the surface, it sounds like your typical survival horror post-apocalyptic video game, but it's so much more than that. And really what sets this game apart from other video games is just how much you care about the characters. Ellie and Joel's relationship and how it grows and evolves throughout their journey is easily the best thing about this game. And of course the action is great and there's really intense gameplay sequences that I love, but really it's just the cutscenes and the moments of dialogue between these characters that really makes it something special. There's also just an incredible sense of realism in every aspect of this game. When you walk down a hallway as Joel, he'll put his hand on the wall as he moves across it. Or when you shine your flashlight at Ellie's face, she'll start blinking and then she'll walk away. These seem like such small things, but it's this insane attention to detail that makes this game feel so real and authentic. And I know graphics have developed immensely since this game came out in 2013, but to this day, I still think they really hold up here. Joel and Ellie's character models are so lifelike, and to this day, I think this is one of the most realistic depictions of human beings that I've ever seen in a video game. Of course, the gameplay is something we have to talk about. Once you get past the first couple hours, I think it really becomes second nature to you and it all feels seamless. None of the controls feel out of sorts. My favorite weapon to use is the bow and arrow, because when you pull it back and you take someone out with it, it is the most satisfying feeling. Some really intense sequences come from using that thing. And the violence in this game is just brutal. You spend a lot of the time, beating people's heads off or choking them out or blowing them to bits with bombs and stuff like that. It's a lot. And I've always thought that with any form of media, violence is only really good if it makes sense and it serves the story in some kind of way. And here, even though it is really gruesome, I think it does, because this is a world where our main characters are just desperately trying to survive, and Joel and Ellie don't kill people because they want to, but because they have to. So in that way, I think the violence and the intensity of it and the rawness of it kind of adds to how real the threat feels. And again, it goes back to that sense of realism. And while the combat is really great, it's definitely not the main focus, as I've said earlier, because this game takes most of its time with the cinematics and developing its characters. And there's a few moments that I really want to talk about here. First of which is the fall sequence. One of the best cinematics in the entire game is when Ellie runs off after she finds out that Joel's planning on handing her over to Tommy and having him deliver her to the Fireflies. And then Joel finds her in this house and they have this really emotional conversation. And this moment's really great because you just kind of realize how much their relationship has actually progressed. And then you have that moment where Joel's about to drop Ellie off and leave her, but then he decides he's going to take her to the Fireflies. It's a great scene. I love their little exchange. And then one of my favorite sequences in the game is the winter chapter, where you get to start playing as Ellie and you take her hunting, which is really cool. But the main reason I love this chapter is how dark it is and the places that it goes with the characters. We get introduced to this guy named David, who's actually voiced by Nolan North, who plays Nathan Drake in the Uncharted series, if you didn't already know. And he seems like a nice guy, but from the first time you hear him speak, something seems off about him. But Ellie kind of warms up to him a little bit, and there's this whole sequence where they're fighting off all these infected that are coming at them at their barn. And then they have this moment where they're sitting by a fire and talking, and David reveals that Ellie and Joel actually killed a lot of his men. So obviously he's not a fan of them. And then Ellie escapes and she gets some medicine to Joel, who's still recovering from his incident that happened in fall. But then while she's there, she realizes that David's men actually tracked her, and she has to lead them off in order to keep Joel safe. Then David's men kidnap Ellie and they bring her back to David. They lock her up in this cage and they're kind of insinuating that David's planning on chopping her up. It's a really scary sequence. What's great about this moment is that you get that cinematic where David kind of explains his motivations to Ellie and how he and his men are just trying to stay alive. And even though you hate this guy and you just think he's so evil, you can kind of see where he's coming from. There are no heroes in this world. There's no good guys or bad guys. Everyone's just trying to survive, and it's either kill or be killed. And this scene really hits that home. Ellie eventually escapes, and you have this whole sequence where you run around this restaurant trying to get a hold of this knife to kill David. She eventually does kill him by stabbing him a lot, and then Joel shows up to find her. She's obviously really shaken up by this, so she starts crying, and Joel kind of holds her in his arms. It's a really, Really powerful moment, one of the most emotional in the entire game. And then we have the finale of the game. It cuts to spring. Joel and Ellie finally get to the hospital in Utah that they're searching for. And of course, I gotta talk about the whole hospital sequence, but there's a couple of really great moments leading up to that I want to mention. One of them is this.
Here we go. Ellie? Ellie?
What?
The ladder. Come on.
Right.
That scene is just amazing to me because the whole game you're so used to Ellie just immediately getting you the ladder and getting to where you need to go. But here she's clearly experiencing some PTSD from what happened in Winter, and she's kind of out of it, so when you hit triangle, nothing happens. And then Joel has to call her out a couple of times to get her attention. So they literally found a way to develop her character through gameplay and not through a cinematic. I just think that's incredible. This is the kind of storytelling that can only be achieved through video games, and that's why I think it's such a powerful art form if it's used in the right way. And then there's the giraffe scene, which I absolutely love. Ellie and Joel find this one giraffe and they start petting it before they find this whole group of them. The look of pure joy on Ellie's face is so great, especially when you consider everything she's been through leading up to this moment. Also, the music in this scene is phenomenal, and by far the best thing about this moment is the visual metaphor that goes along with it. The fact that it's showing that in such a broken, messed up world, there can still be beauty and there can be life. And I think on the surface, it's kind of a small moment and not really a lot is happening, but it says so much, even though there's no real dialogue in here. And it's just an amazing moment. I love it. And from here, the final sequence kicks in. The Fireflies get to Joel and Ellie. Joel wakes up after being knocked out by one of them. He's talking to Marlene, and she explains that now that they have Ellie, they're able to reverse engineer a vaccine for the virus. But then Joel realizes that in order for them to do that, they'd have to kill Ellie because the virus grows on the brain. And Joel cannot have that because in his eyes, Ellie is the only thing worth living for in this world. So then he decides to kill the Fireflies and take Ellie back. This is definitely one of the most intense sequences of gameplay in the entire thing. It's really challenging. You have to get from floor to floor and take out all these guards. There's one moment in particular here that left me absolutely speechless, and that's when you walk into the operating room and you see the three surgeons about to operate on Ellie. The game doesn't really tell you what to do here, but when you're standing in the doorway and you see these doctors about to operate on Ellie, you slowly realize what you have to do, and then you have to kill one of these doctors in order to escape with Ellie. And so in this moment of gameplay, you as the player feel the same amount of hesitation that Joel feels when he realizes what he has to do. And it's handled so well. And so then you grab Ellie and you run to the elevator as all these guards are chasing you and the music is swelling really loudly. Such an amazing moment, really beautiful stuff. And then they get out. And now I want to talk about the very ending of the game. This game has one of the more controversial video game endings in recent memory. A lot of people loved it, a lot of people hated it. It's become very divisive, and that's specifically because of the choice that Joel makes. He lies to Ellie and tells her that there happened to be a lot more people like her who were immune to the disease, and the Fireflies tried, but they couldn't find out a way to make a cure, so they stopped looking for one. Then they head back to Tommy's place to essentially start their new life, and Ellie asks Joel to swear to her that everything he said about the Fireflies was true. And then he says, "I swear." And Ellie's like, "Okay." And then the game ends. I think this ending is perfect, and I'll tell you why. Joel is the kind of guy who has essentially lost everything. Before he met Ellie, there was really nothing he was living for other than surviving. And throughout the course of the game, you watch him learn to care for a young girl again. And he cannot lose that. He loves Ellie too much in order to let her go. Is what he did selfish? Absolutely, but what would you do if you've lost everything and now the one thing that you care about in the world was about to be taken from you? It's the moral ambiguity of this ending and the moral questions that it raises that make it really special in my opinion. And it's the fact that Joel cares about Ellie so much that he would rather live in a world full of flesh-eating zombies than live in a world without her. I think that's fucking Shakespearean. It's amazing storytelling, and for me, it created a perfect ending for an already amazing game. The Last of Us is not only one of my favorite video games ever, it's one of the best pieces of art I've ever experienced. It's so much more than just a video game. I think it transcends what the medium can do. It has amazing characters that you really latch onto, an incredible story, the way it's directed, the music, the graphics, the gameplay. It's one of the most unforgettable experiences I've ever had with a video game, and I know for certain it's one we'll all be talking about for a really long time. The Last of Us is without a doubt a masterpiece and one of the best video games of all time, and of course, it gets my highest grade of a 10 out of 10. Alright guys, so those are my thoughts on The Last of Us. I have always wanted to talk about this game on my channel, and I've always wanted to review a video game on this channel, so I'm really glad I got to do that. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. Stay tuned for my review of The Last of Us Part 2. It comes out next week. I cannot wait to play it. I really hope it's good. Also, be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.